He set it on a Tuesday evening, in the corridor outside the dining room, with the candles still guttering from the draft of the closing door. Mrs. Tull was 3 paces behind them, carrying a tray of cleared glassware, and she heard every word. "You will sleep in the east wing until you learn your place." Phoebe Croft, who had been Phoebe Waverley until 6 weeks prior, stopped walking. She did not turn. She did not ask him to repeat himself. She stood very still in the corridor with her hands folded at her waist while her husband's footsteps continued toward his study. And when the door closed behind him, she remained where she was for another moment, not collecting herself, not trembling, not doing any of the things a woman in her position might reasonably have done. She was thinking. Then she inclined her head slightly toward Mrs. Tull, said, "I shall need fresh linen sent across, if you would be so kind," and walked toward the east wing as if she had always intended to sleep there. The east wing of Aldenmere Park had not been properly inhabited in 11 years. It had been built in the previous century as a mirror to the west wing, identical in proportion, if not in grace, but the late Duke had closed it after the last of his sisters married and moved to Dorset. Since then, it had served as a repository for furniture that no longer suited the principal rooms, for trunks of clothing belonging to people who had died or departed, for the slow accumulation of things a great house cannot bring itself to discard. The corridor smelled of cold plaster and beeswax gone stale. The wallpaper in the largest bedchamber, French, hand-painted, once the pride of the Duchess who had commissioned it, had begun to peel at the seams where damp had crept through the north-facing wall. Phoebe stood in the doorway of this room and looked at it for a long time. Then she set her candle on the mantelpiece, opened the window to let the night air move through the staleness, and began to make a list. She had always been a woman who made lists. Her father, a solicitor in Hertfordshire with more daughters than prospects, had raised her on the principle that any situation could be improved by a clear inventory of its deficiencies. Phoebe had 4 sisters, all of them prettier, all of them louder, and she had learned early that the one who noticed what was missing was more useful than the one who lamented what was lost. When Nathaniel Croft, the 6th Duke of Aldenmere, had been persuaded by his mother and his solicitors that a wife was necessary, for the succession, for the estate, for the appearance of stability that creditors and tenants alike required, Phoebe Waverley had been selected not for her beauty or her connections, but for her willingness. She had been willing. That was the sum of her qualification, and Nathaniel had resented her for it from the first morning of their marriage. He was not a cruel man by nature. This was what made his cruelty so precise. A man who enjoyed causing pain would have been easier to navigate. His provocations would have had a pattern, a rhythm, something Phoebe could have mapped and anticipated. But Nathaniel's coldness came from a deeper source, the conviction that his life had been arranged without his consent, and that Phoebe, quiet, capable, unremarkable Phoebe, was the visible evidence of that arrangement. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike. He simply treated her as though she were a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong room, something to be endured until it could be moved. The banishment to the East Wing was the culmination of 6 weeks of this. There had been no specific incident, no argument at dinner, no embarrassment before guests. Phoebe had simply existed in his house with too much competence and too little drama, and Nathaniel, who had spent the day reviewing estate accounts that revealed the full extent of debts his father had concealed, had needed someone to punish who would not fight back. She did not fight back. She unpacked her trunk, which Mrs. Tull's girl brought across within the hour, and she slept that night in a bed that smelled of lavender sachets, placed there by someone who had died before Phoebe was born. In the morning, she rose early, before the household stirred, and walked every room of the East Wing with her list and a stub of pencil. There were 14 rooms in total, 6 bedchambers of varying size, 2 dressing rooms, a sitting room with south-facing windows that caught the morning light beautifully, a small library that had been emptied of its books but retained its shelves, a linen closet, a still room that connected to the servants' corridor below, and 2 rooms so filled with discarded furniture that she could not yet determine their original purpose. The bones of the wing were sound. The roof did not leak. The chimneys, when she asked Cavender to send a boy to inspect them, drew cleanly. What the East Wing lacked was not structure, but attention. the slow, daily work of inhabitation that turns a collection of rooms into a place where life is conducted, Phoebe began. She did not ask Nathaniel's permission. This was not defiance, it was simply that the question did not occur to her. He had told her to sleep in the east wing. He had not told her to suffer there. Within a week she had the south-facing sitting room cleared of its stored furniture and arranged with pieces she had selected from the other rooms, a writing desk with good light, 2 armchairs that wanted only new cushions, a small table for tea. She asked Mrs. Tull for candles and received them without comment. She asked Cavender about the damp in the north wall, and he sent a man to repoint the exterior brickwork, adding the cost to the quarterly maintenance accounts without troubling the Duke. Cavender was the first to understand what was happening. He was a man of 50 with 30 years' service to the estate, and he had watched the late Duke's marriage collapse in a manner far louder and more destructive than this one. He recognized in Phoebe something he valued above all other qualities in the people he served. She was practical. When she asked him about the tenants on the eastern boundary of the estate, the farms that bordered the river, which had flooded twice in the previous winter, he brought her the surveyor's report and the drainage proposals without being asked twice. When she inquired about the lease renewals that were due at Michaelmas, he did not say that such matters were handled through the Duke's study. He brought her the ledger. Mrs. Croft, he said, standing in her sitting room with the afternoon light falling across the desk where she had spread the estate maps. The Breck Farm drainage has been outstanding since your father-in-law's time. The cost was approved 3 years ago, but never disbursed. Why not? The late Duke preferred to defer expenditure wherever possible, ma'am. The current Duke has not yet reviewed the outstanding approvals. Phoebe looked at the figure. It was not large, not by the standards of an estate like Aldenmere, but it was enough to prevent the lower fields from flooding for the 3rd consecutive winter. Disperse it, she said. Cavender hesitated for precisely 2 seconds. Then he inclined his head and made a note in his own ledger, and the drainage work began the following week. It was through the drainage that Silas Breck first came to the east wing. He was a tenant farmer of the old kind, weathered, cautious, suspicious of promises from the great house. And when the work crew appeared at his boundary ditch with instructions and materials, he walked the 2 miles to Aldenmere to confirm it with his own eyes. He was directed not to the Duke's study in the west wing, but to the sitting room on the south side of the east wing, where a woman he had never met was writing letters at a desk by the window. Phoebe offered him tea. He refused. She showed him the approved drainage plan and the disbursement record. He studied them with the careful attention of a man who has been disappointed before and does not intend to be again. The lower field has been under water since October, he said. I know. Cavender showed me the survey. The late Duke said he would see to it. He did not. I am seeing to it now. Breck looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and left. He did not come back for 3 weeks, and when he did, he brought his wife, who brought a jar of damson preserves, and they sat in Phoebe's sitting room and told her about the state of the eastern farms in a level of detail that no one at the great house had heard in years. This was how it began. Not with confrontation, not with any grand declaration of authority, but with a jar of preserves and an honest conversation about drainage. By the 2nd month, the East Wing had become something that Aldenmere had not possessed in a generation, a functioning center of domestic governance. Phoebe received Cavender there each morning to review the day's business. She met tenants there on Thursdays, not by formal appointment, but by the gradual understanding that the East Wing sitting room was where problems were heard and, more importantly, where they were addressed. Mrs. Tull, who had initially sent a girl across with Phoebe's meals on a tray, began taking her own tea there in the afternoons, and it was over these quiet cups that the household management of Aldenmere shifted, imperceptibly but completely, from the formal housekeeper's parlor beside the kitchen to the sunny room where Phoebe kept her lists. The West Wing, meanwhile, grew quieter. Nathaniel noticed this the way one notices a draft, not the thing itself, but its effects. His breakfast was still served in the dining room. His study was still maintained. His clothes were still pressed and his fire still laid. But the house felt emptied of something he could not name, a subtle withdrawal of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The footmen were present when summoned, but no longer anticipated. The flowers in the hall were replaced less frequently. The cook sent dishes that were correct but uninspired, as though the kitchen's attention had been gently redirected elsewhere. He told himself this was what he had wanted. He had married a woman he did not choose, and he had put her where she could not trouble him, and his household was running as it should. He sat in his study with the estate accounts and the correspondence from his solicitors and the invitations to dinners he did not wish to attend, and he told himself that the silence was peace. It was his mother who said it first. The Dowager Duchess had taken Nathaniel's side in the matter of the East Wing, not vocally, not with any explicit endorsement, but with the quiet complicity of a woman who had herself endured an unhappy marriage and believed that endurance was what wives were for. She had watched Phoebe's removal with the same expression she wore when furniture was rearranged, mild interest, no objection. But the Dowager was also a woman who understood houses, and she understood that a house with two centers of gravity was a house in the process of choosing. She crossed to the East Wing on a Thursday afternoon in late June, 3 months after Phoebe's banishment. She had not announced her visit. She simply appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, where Phoebe was reviewing the Michaelmas accounts with Cavender, and stood there until they looked up. "I came to see what you have done with the wallpaper," she said. Phoebe had, in fact, done nothing with the wallpaper. The French hand-painted paper in her bedchamber remained as it was, peeling, water-stained, beautiful in its ruin. She had chosen to leave it. It was the one extravagance she permitted herself, the acknowledgement that some things are lovelier for having been neglected than they would be if restored. The Dowager walked through the rooms. She said very little. She ran one gloved finger along the mantelpiece in the first bedchamber and inspected it for dust. There was none. Mrs. Tull's girl had been thorough, and she touched the curtains Phoebe had rehung, pausing at the fabric as though she recognized it from another era of the house. She examined the books that had begun to accumulate on the library shelves, volumes borrowed from the main library and not returned, parish registers Cavender had brought for reference, a botanical guide Phoebe had ordered from London, and a slim volume on estate drainage that she had found in the late Duke's collection and marked at 3 separate pages. The Dowager opened this last book, noted the markings, and closed it without comment. She stood for a long time at the window of the south-facing sitting room, looking out at the gardens below, where 2 of the undergardeners were repairing the border wall that had collapsed in the spring rains. The afternoon light was warm on the floorboards, and somewhere below the window a blackbird was singing, the full, unhurried song of a bird that has found a territory it intends to keep. "Nathaniel does not know about the drainage expenditure," she said. It was not a question. "He approved it 3 years ago. Cavender has the record." His father approved it. The estate approved it. Cavender disbursed it against the standing authorization. The Dowager turned from the window. Her face was difficult to read. It always was. But there was something in her expression that had not been there when she arrived. Not warmth, exactly. Recognition. "You are not what I expected," she said. "No," Phoebe agreed. "I do not imagine I am." The Dowager came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She did not explain her presence, and Phoebe did not ask her to. They sat together in the sitting room while the house moved around them, and the Dowager began, very gradually, to tell Phoebe things about the estate that no one had told her before, where the boundary disputes lay, which tenants were reliable and which would cheat the tithe if unwatched, how the previous Duchess had managed the harvest supper, and why it mattered. She was, Phoebe realized, handing her the estate in the way that women have always handed estates to one another, not through documents and signatures, but through the accumulated knowledge of what works. Nathaniel learned about the drainage from his solicitor, who mentioned it in passing during a review of the quarterly accounts during one of the Duke's weeks in London, attending to matters in the House of Lords. It was a small line item, competently recorded, properly authorized, but it had not passed through his study, and he knew it. He returned to Aldenmere on a Friday evening and went directly to the East Wing. He had not been there since the night he had sent Phoebe to it. The corridor, which he remembered as dark and smelling of disuse, was lit with candles in cleaned sconces and smelled of beeswax and the particular warmth of rooms that are lived in. He could hear voices, Mrs. Tull's and another woman's he did not immediately recognize, and then a lower voice that he identified, with some surprise, as Cavender's. They were laughing. Not loudly, not inappropriately, but with the easy familiarity of people who spend time together. He stood outside the sitting room door. Through the gap, he could see a room he did not recognize, not because it had been transformed with expense, but because it had been transformed with use. There were papers on the desk, a teacup on the small table, a shawl over the back of a chair. His mother was sitting by the window with her embroidery. Phoebe was at the desk, writing something while Cavender stood beside her, pointing to a line in a ledger. Mrs. Tull was pouring tea. The room was complete. It did not need him. Nothing in it reached toward him or waited for him or was arranged to accommodate his arrival. It was a room that functioned entirely and quietly without him. He knocked. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to be felt. He heard the conversation stop, heard the small sounds of a room rearranging itself around an interruption. Then Phoebe's voice, calm and unhurried. "Come in." He opened the door. 4 faces turned toward him, Phoebe's, his mother's, Cavender's, Mrs. Tull's, and in each of them he saw something different. Mrs. Tull looked frightened. Cavender looked neutral, the careful blankness of a servant who has survived multiple masters. His mother looked at him with an expression he would later identify as disappointment, though at the time he mistook it for something else. Phoebe looked at him the way she had looked at the East Wing on her first night, with assessment. Not anger, not triumph, not the satisfaction of having proved a point. She was simply taking the measure of the situation as she took the measure of everything and determining what it required. "Your Grace," she said, "will you sit down?" He did not sit down. He stood in the doorway of the room his wife had built from the ruins of his punishment, and he said, "The drainage expenditure was not authorized through my study. It was authorized by the estate 3 years ago. Cavender can show you the record." "I am aware of the record. I am asking why it was dispersed without my knowledge." Phoebe set down her pen. "Because the lower fields were flooding, and the authorization existed, and no one had acted on it. I asked Cavender to proceed. If you wish to reverse the expenditure, the work is already complete, but you are welcome to review the accounts." She said this without defiance and without apology. She said it the way one states a fact about the weather, not as an argument but as a condition that exists regardless of anyone's feelings about it. Nathaniel looked at Cavender. "You report to me." "I do, Your Grace." "Then why was I not consulted?" Cavender, who had survived the previous duke by knowing when to speak and when to remain still, chose this moment to speak. "Mrs. Croft inquired about outstanding maintenance approvals. I provided the information she requested. The disbursement was within the standing authorization granted by the late Duke and never rescinded. No additional approval was required." This was true. It was also, Nathaniel understood, the answer of a man who had chosen his allegiance and was stating it plainly. He left the room without sitting down. He walked back through the corridor to the west wing, to his study, where the fire was laid but not lit, and the desk held only the correspondence his valet had sorted that morning. He sat in his chair and looked at the room he had claimed as his own, the mahogany desk, the portrait of his father above the mantel, the shelves of books he had not opened since Cambridge, and for the first time he saw it clearly. It was a room arranged for authority. It was not a room arranged for work. The following weeks were difficult in a way that Nathaniel had not anticipated. He had expected, if he had expected anything, that confrontation would follow. That Phoebe would press her advantage, make demands, insist on changes to their arrangement. She did none of these things. She continued exactly as she had been, rising early, working through the morning with Cavender, receiving tenants on Thursdays, taking tea with Mrs. Tull, and increasingly with his mother. She did not come to the West Wing. She did not send messages. She did not adjust her life by a single degree to accommodate his displeasure. This was, he realized, the most devastating thing she could have done. Not because it was calculated. He was becoming increasingly certain that calculation was not in Phoebe's nature, but because it was genuine. She had been given a wing of the house, and she had made it her own, and she was not going to abandon it simply because the man who had sent her there had now noticed what she had built. She was not punishing him. She was not making a point. She was living her life, and her life had arranged itself around the East Wing the way water arranges itself around stone. naturally, inevitably, without malice. He began finding reasons to walk through the east wing corridor. He told himself he was inspecting the repairs, the repointed brickwork, the cleaned sconces, the window that Cavender had reglazed. He told himself he was reviewing the household arrangements, which was his right and his responsibility. But he walked slowly, and he listened, and what he heard was a house that was alive in a way his wing was not, the sound of Mrs. Tull discussing the week's menus, the scratch of Phoebe's pen, the low murmur of Cavender reporting on the progress of the harvest preparations. There was a rhythm to the east wing that the west wing had never possessed, the particular hum of a place where work is being done by people who trust one another, where the day has a shape that is not imposed from above, but grown from within. He noticed, too, the small migrations. A painting of the estate grounds that had hung in the west wing gallery for decades appeared one morning on the east wing landing. Mrs. Tull had moved it, she explained when asked, because the light was better there. The good tea service, which had lived in the butler's pantry adjacent to the formal dining room, was now kept in the east wing still-room cupboard. The silver candlesticks from the morning room had found their way to Phoebe's desk. None of these removals had been ordered, none had been discussed. They had simply happened, the way a river shifts its course, not through any single dramatic event, but through the steady daily work of water finding the path of least resistance. Once, passing the open door of the sitting room, he saw Phoebe reading aloud from a letter. She was reading it to his mother, who was laughing, actually laughing, a sound he had not heard from her in years. He did not stop. He walked past and continued to his study, and sat there with the sound of his mother's laughter in his ears and the knowledge settling into him like damp into plaster that he had been wrong. Not wrong about the marriage that had been arranged, and arrangements were what they were, but wrong about Phoebe. He had looked at her and seen the evidence of his own diminished agency, a woman chosen for him, a life prescribed. He had not seen her. He had not seen the lists, the competence, the quiet attention to the things that actually sustained a house and an estate, and the hundreds of lives that depended on them. He had not seen that the quality he had dismissed as mere willingness was something far more formidable, the capacity to take what she was given and make it enough. It was September when he knocked on her door again. The harvest was in, the best in 4 years, Cavender had reported, owing in part to the drainage work on the eastern farms and in part to the new rotation Phoebe had suggested after reading the agricultural pamphlets she had ordered from a bookseller in London. The Michaelmas accounts were settled, the tenant rents collected without dispute for the first time in memory, and the tenants on the eastern boundary had sent a letter, addressed to Mrs. Croft, not to the Duke, thanking her for the drainage work and reporting that the lower fields had held through the summer storms. Nathaniel had read this letter. Cavender had left it, with the quarterly reports on his desk. Whether this was pointed or merely efficient, Nathaniel could not say. He knocked in the evening, after dinner. The September air was still warm, but carried the first suggestion of autumn. Wood smoke from somewhere on the estate, the sweetness of late-blooming roses in the garden below. Phoebe opened the door herself. She had long since stopped waiting for servants to announce visitors to a wing of the house that operated on its own terms. She was still in her day dress, a simple muslin with a Spencer jacket over it against the evening chill, and her hair had loosened slightly from its pins in the way it did by the end of a long day. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped aside. The room was lit with candles, the good beeswax ones that Mrs. Tull had been quietly redirecting from the West Wing stores for months, and there was a fire in the grate, and the desk was covered with correspondence, and a shawl lay over the chair where she had been sitting, and the room smelled of warmth and ink and the faint sweetness of the damson preserves that Mrs. Breck had sent up from the farm. He stood in the room and he looked at his wife, and he said, "I was wrong to send you here." Phoebe considered this. "Yes," she said, "you were. I would like you to return to the West Wing." "No." The word was not sharp. It was not triumphant. It was the same word she had used when she declined a second cup of tea, or when Cavender proposed an expenditure she considered unnecessary. It was a word that had been weighed and found to be the correct one. "This is my home now," she said. "You gave it to me and I have made it mine. If you wish to be part of it, you are welcome, but I will not leave it." Nathaniel stood in the room his wife had built and understood, with the clarity that comes only after prolonged and willful blindness, that the question had never been whether Phoebe would learn her place. She had learned it the first morning. She had learned it with a list and a stub of pencil in the south-facing light, and she had made it more completely her own than any room he had ever occupied. The question, the only question that had ever mattered, was whether he would learn his. "Then may I sit down?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she moved the shawl from the chair by the fire and gestured toward it, and he sat, and she returned to her desk, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The candles burned. The fire settled. Outside, the September wind moved through the garden that Phoebe had not planted but had caused to be tended, and the east wing of Aldenmere Park held its warmth the way a well-built thing does, steadily, without effort, without any need to prove itself. He came back the following evening, and the evening after that. He did not move his things, Phoebe did not invite him to, and he did not ask. He simply appeared at her door after dinner, and she let him in, and they sat together in a room that smelled of beeswax and ink, and he began, very slowly, to tell her things. About the debts his father had left, not just the amounts, which were considerable, but the manner of their accumulation. The racing debts disguised as estate improvements, the gifts to women whose names appeared nowhere in the household accounts, the slow bleeding of a fortune that had taken generations to build. About the House of Lords sessions that drained him, the interminable debates, the posturing, the weight of a title he had not wanted and could not set down, the particular loneliness of sitting in a chamber of 600 men and knowing that not one of them would notice if his seat were empty. About the morning he had learned his mother had chosen his wife for him, and the rage that had settled into his chest like a stone and stayed there for months. Rage not at Phoebe, but at the narrowing of his life, the closing of doors he had not even known were open until they were shut. Phoebe listened. She did not comfort him, that was not yet what they were to each other, but she listened with the same attention she gave to drainage reports and Michaelmas accounts, the same steady focus that did not waver and did not judge, and Nathaniel discovered that being heard by someone who did not need anything from him was a different experience entirely from being heard by someone who did. She asked questions occasionally, practical ones, about the debts, about which obligations were secured and which might be renegotiated, and he answered them, and in answering them, he found that the weight of carrying them alone had been heavier than the debts themselves. The household adjusted around them with the seamless discretion of a well-run estate. Mrs. Tull began laying 2 places for evening tea in the East Wing sitting room without being asked. Cavender brought the morning reports to Phoebe's desk as he always had, but lingered now until Nathaniel arrived, so that the 3 of them reviewed the day's business together. The dowager, who missed nothing, said nothing, but she began to take her breakfast in the East Wing morning room, and this was understood by everyone to be a statement. By Christmas, Nathaniel's study in the West Wing had become a place he visited rather than inhabited. His books had migrated, carried by his valet, a few at a time, without instruction, to the shelves in Phoebe's library. His correspondence was delivered to the East Wing desk. His coat hung on the hook beside the sitting-room door, next to Phoebe's shawl, and the 2 garments hanging together in the candlelight looked like a conversation that had been going on for longer than anyone could remember. He moved into her bedchamber on a night in January when the cold was bitter and the West Wing fires could not hold against it. He did not ask. He simply appeared at her door with his candle and his dressing gown, and Phoebe opened the door and stepped aside, and the French wallpaper with its water stains and its peeling seams witnessed what the rest of the house had already understood. 3 years later, on a morning in April when the East Wing garden was in full bloom and the sound of a child's laughter carried through the open windows, Phoebe sat at her desk and reviewed the accounts for the quarter. Beside her, in the chair by the fire that had become so thoroughly his that the cushion bore the permanent impression of his weight, Nathaniel read a letter from his solicitor confirming the final settlement of his father's debts. The estate was clear. The farms were productive. The tenants were secure. Their son, William, 8 months old, born in the East Wing bedchamber with the French wallpaper, while the autumn rain streamed down the windows and Mrs. Tull boiled water she did not need simply to have something to do with her hands, was being carried through the garden by Mrs. Tull, who had not been persuaded to relinquish him to the nursemaid and showed no signs of intending to. The dowager sat in the morning room writing letters to her sister in Bath, describing the child's temperament in terms that suggested she had personally supervised his development from the first breath. Cavender was in the estate office reviewing the spring planting schedule with Silas Breck, who now came to the East Wing not on Thursdays but whenever he pleased, and was received accordingly. Nathaniel set down his letter and looked at his wife. She was wearing a morning dress of pale gray wool, the same shade, though not the same dress, that she had worn on the first morning she had woken in the East Wing and made her list. Her hair was pinned simply. Her attention was on the ledger. "Phoebe," she looked up. "I should have chosen you," he said. "If they had given me every woman in England, I should have chosen you." She regarded him with the expression he had come to know better than any other, steady, considered, undeceived. She was not a woman who required declarations, but she was a woman who knew what they cost a man like Nathaniel, and she received this one with the gravity it deserved. "You did choose me," she said. "It simply took you longer than it should have." He laughed, a sound that 3 years ago would have been unimaginable in this house, and she returned to her ledger, and the morning light filled the room the way it had filled it every day since she had first opened the window and let it in, completely, without reservation, as though it had only been waiting to be asked. The east wing of Aldenmere Park stands today as it stood then, the living heart of the house, the place where decisions are made and tenants are received and children are raised, the wing that was given as a punishment and kept as a kingdom. The west wing is maintained, of course. The study is dusted, the portraits are cleaned, but no one sleeps there, and no one works there, and the fires are lit only when guests require the additional rooms. Phoebe never did repair the French wallpaper. It hangs in their bedchamber still, peeling, water-stained, beautiful, a reminder that the most lasting things are not built from what is given freely, but from what is made, patiently and without complaint, from what was meant to be endured. There are stories like this one, stories of rooms that become worlds, of silence that becomes strength, of women who were handed nothing and made everything. They arrive here, like a door finally opened from the inside whenever they are ready.